Settle in now, and let the quiet, heavy curtain of history fall around us, transporting us back to a time when the world was poised on the razor's edge between the fading glory of the ancients and the dawning shadows of the medieval age. We are turning our eyes to the 6th century, to a Mediterranean world that is fractured, yearning, and about to be set ablaze by the most powerful, seductive, and dangerous dream of all, the dream of Rome restored. Take a slow, deep breath and let the silence of the room embrace you. We are standing in the year 535 AD, not in the ruined, grass-grown streets of Rome, but in the shimmering, golden court of Constantinople, the new Rome, where the marble is polished to a mirror sheen and the air is thick with the scent of frankincense and the whispers of imperial ambition. Here sits the Emperor Justinian, a man of sleepless energy and boundless vision, who looked at the map of the known world and saw not what it was, but what it ought to be. To him, the loss of the Western Empire to the barbarian tribes, the Vandals in Africa, the Visigoths in Spain, and most importantly, the Ostrogoths in Italy was not a permanent state of affairs, but a temporary divine error that it was his sacred duty to correct. He did not see himself as the Emperor of the East. He was the Roman Emperor, sole and indivisible, and his heart ached for the ancient cradle of his civilization, Italy. The instrument of his will was already forged, a general of such singular talent and loyalty that his name would echo through the centuries alongside the greatest conquerors of antiquity, Belisarius. Fresh from his miraculous, swift reconquest of North Africa from the Vandals, Belisarius was the sword in Justinian's hand, a man who commanded not just with tactical brilliance, but with a quiet, disciplined charisma that inspired devotion in his diverse army of heavy cavalry, Hunnish archers, and hardened infantry. The pretext for the invasion for every great war requires a legal justification was found in the dynastic struggles of the Ostrogothic court. The Goths, who had ruled Italy for decades, were not savages living in huts. They were admirers of Rome, maintaining its senate, its aqueducts, and its laws, ruling as a military aristocracy over a Roman population. But the murder of the pro-Roman Gothic queen Amalasuntha by her usurping cousin Theodahad gave Justinian the moral cause he needed. He declared that the usurper must be punished and that Italy must return to the imperial fold. The campaign began not with a thunderclap, but with a steady, inexorable tide rising from the south. In 535, Belisarius landed in Sicily, the granary of the ancient world. Imagine the sight of the imperial fleet, hundreds of dromons with their lateen sails catching the Mediterranean breeze, gliding silently into the harbor of Syracuse. The conquest of Sicily was remarkably swift, almost a procession rather than a war, for the local Roman population greeted Belisarius not as an invader, but as a liberator, a long-lost father returning home. The Gothic garrisons, few in number and isolated, surrendered with barely a murmur, and by the end of the year, Belisarius stood on the northern tip of the island, looking across the narrow Strait of Messina toward the brooding, mountainous mainland of Italy. The crossing into Italy proper marked the beginning of the true struggle. Theodahad, the Gothic king, was a man of learning and philosophy, a lover of Plato, but he possessed a trembling, indecisive heart that was utterly unsuited for the brutal necessities of war. He attempted to negotiate, offering to surrender the kingdom for a pension, then wavered, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, while Belisarius marched steadily north. The first great test came at the ancient city of Naples. Naples was a city of immense strength, guarded by high walls and the deep blue waters of the bay, and garrisoned by a resolute Gothic force that refused to surrender. Belisarius laid siege to the city, but time was his enemy. He could not afford to be bogged down while the main Gothic army mobilized in the north. The breakthrough came through a stroke of quiet ingenuity, the kind of detail that history loves to preserve. One of Belisarius's Isaurian soldiers, exploring the aqueducts that fed the city, discovered a passage through the water channels that had been neglected. Imagine the scene in the dead of night. A column of armored men, their metal clinking softly, moving through the damp, echoing darkness of the subterranean stone tunnels, creeping beneath the impregnable walls like ghosts. They emerged into the sleeping city, seizing the towers from the inside and opening the gates to the waiting army. Naples fell, and although Belisarius tried to restrain his troops, the sack of the city was a brutal reminder to all of Italy that the Roman legions, though liberators, were also conquerors who demanded submission. The fall of Naples sent a shockwave through the Gothic nobility. Realizing that their king, Theodahad, was doing nothing to save them, they gathered in the Great Plains outside Rome and deposed him. In his place, they raised a warrior to the throne, a man of humble origin but proven valor named Witiges. Theodahad attempted to flee to Ravenna but was cut down on the road, a lonely end for a philosopher king in a time of wolves. Witiges was a soldier, slow of mind perhaps, but resolute of purpose. He realized that the Gothic forces were scattered and needed time to regroup. In a strategic decision that would have immense consequences, he decided to abandon Rome. He withdrew the main Gothic army north to Ravenna, the marsh-bound capital, to gather every able-bodied warrior, leaving Rome open to Belisarius. And so, in December of 536 AD, a moment of profound historical poetry occurred. As the Gothic garrison marched out of the Flaminian Gate to the north, heading towards Ravenna, Belisarius and his imperial army marched in through the Azanarian Gate to the south. Rome, the eternal city, the mother of the empire, was back in Roman hands after 60 years of barbarian rule, but it was a hollow triumph, for the city Belisarius entered was a shadow of its ancient self. The vast population of the classical era had shrunk to perhaps 50,000 souls living amidst the colossal ruins of the Forum and the Colosseum. The great baths were quiet, the palaces on the Palatine Hill were gathering dust, yet the symbolic power of the city was undiminished. Belisarius knew that Witiges would return, and that he would return with a force that vastly outnumbered the small imperial army of 5,000 men. He immediately set to work repairing the ancient Aurelian walls, forcing the citizens to work alongside the soldiers, piling stones, clearing moats, and turning the sprawling city into a fortress. He stocked the granaries with grain from Sicily. He waited. And in the spring of 537, the Goths returned. They came like a moving forest of steel, an army estimated by historians to number anywhere from 30,000 to 150,000 warriors, a force so vast that their campfires at night looked like a reflection of the starry sky on the earth. Witiges, determined to crush the Greek invader, as they called the Byzantines, laid siege to Rome. This began the First Siege of Rome, an epic struggle that would last for 1 year and 9 days. It was a time of starvation, heroism, and the slow grinding of attrition. The Goths, unable to breach the massive walls, struck at the very lifeblood of the city, the aqueducts. Imagine the profound, terrible silence that must have fallen over the city when the water stopped flowing. For centuries, the gentle roar of water rushing into the great baths of Caracalla and Diocletian had been the background noise of Roman life. Now, the baths went dry and cold, the fountains ceased their dancing. The great water mills on the Janiculum Hill, which ground the grain for the city's bread, ground to a halt. Belisarius, ever the improviser, moved the mills to floating barges on the Tiber River, using the current of the river itself to turn the wheels, ensuring the city could still make flour. The siege was a series of vicious skirmishes and assaults. On one occasion, the Goths built massive wooden siege towers drawn by oxen. Belisarius, watching from the walls with a bow in his hand, laughed a rare sound in such a grim time and personally shot the lead oxen, bringing the towers to a halt before they could reach the walls. Inside the city, the suffering was immense. The Romans, unaccustomed to the hardships of war, began to grumble against Belisarius. They were hungry, they were terrified, and they wondered if liberation was worth this agony. Belisarius, suspicious of treason, famously deposed the Pope, Silverius, sending him into exile, an act that showed his ruthless dedication to holding the city at all costs. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the discipline of the Roman heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, proved superior. Belisarius would lead sorties out of the gates, using his archers to harass the massed Gothic infantry, whittling down their numbers and their morale. The Goths, suffering from disease in their squalid camps and struggling to feed their massive army in the devastated countryside, began to despair. Finally, after a year of futility, and with imperial reinforcements arriving under the command of John the Sanguinary, Witiges broke the siege. In a chaotic retreat, the Goths burned their camps and marched north, defeated not by walls, but by the will of one man. Belisarius pursued. The war moved north, a slow, methodical conquest of the Gothic strongholds. The climax of this first phase of the war came at Ravenna in 540 AD. Ravenna was impregnable by land, surrounded by treacherous marshes and lagoons, and supplied by the sea. A siege could have lasted for years, but Belisarius achieved victory through a deception so subtle and audacious that it remains legendary. The Goths, exhausted and disillusioned with Witiges, made an extraordinary offer to Belisarius. They admired him, they respected his prowess. They offered to surrender Ravenna and the kingdom, but only if Belisarius himself declared himself Emperor of the West, resurrecting the Western Empire in his own name, independent of Justinian. Belisarius, whose loyalty to Justinian was the defining trait of his soul, feigned acceptance. He allowed the Gothic ambassadors to believe he would take the crown. He marched his army into Ravenna, the gates thrown open by the hopeful Goths. Imagine the tension of that entry. The Gothic warriors stood aside, watching the disciplined Roman columns march in, expecting a coronation. Instead, once the city was secured, Belisarius seized the royal treasury, took Witiges captive, and proclaimed the city taken in the name of the Emperor Justinian. He had won. He had conquered the capital, captured the king, and reclaimed Italy. It seemed for a brief, shining moment in 540 AD that the dream had been realized. Rome was Roman once again, but victory won by deception leaves a bitter taste. The Goths felt betrayed, not defeated, and in Constantinople, Justinian, hearing rumors of the Goths' offer of the crown, grew jealous and suspicious of his greatest general. Instead of allowing Belisarius to finish the pacification of the peninsula, he recalled him to the east to fight the Persians. Belisarius left Italy with the Gothic treasury and the captive king, sailing away from the land he had saved, but he left behind a country that was not truly pacified, a Gothic nobility that was wounded but not broken, and a Roman administration that was about to turn the liberation into a nightmare of taxation and corruption. The seeds of the second, far more tragic phase of the war had already been sown in the rich, blood-soaked soil of Italy. The dream was about to turn into a long, slow, agonizing nightmare. We enter now the middle years of the war, a period where the clarity of conquest dissolves into the murky, heartbreaking reality of occupation and resurgence. If the first phase of the war was an epic of imperial restoration, this second phase is a tragedy of lost opportunities and the rise of a hero who was, by all accounts, one of the most noble figures of the age, yet he was the enemy of Rome. The year is 541 AD. Belisarius has departed, taking the genius of command with him across the sea to Constantinople. In his wake, he left a patchwork of imperial generals, Besses, John, Constantinian men who were brave enough, perhaps, but consumed by rivalry and greed. They did not govern Italy, they looted it. Justinian, facing a massive war with Persia and the devastation of the Great Plague which was sweeping through the empire killing millions, had little money to send to Italy. To compensate, he sent a new breed of official, the Logothetes, the tax collectors. Imagine the bitterness of the Italian people. They had welcomed the imperial armies as liberators, as fellow Romans returning to save them from the barbarian yoke. But now, these liberators demanded taxes that had not been levied for decades, demanding back payment for the years of Gothic rule. The illusion of the golden age of restoration shattered under the weight of fiscal cruelty. The Roman administration became more hated than the Gothic kings had ever been. Into this vacuum of power and goodwill stepped a young Gothic chieftain named Totila, originally Baduila. Totila was chosen as king by the desperate remnants of the Gothic nobility in 541. He was young, charismatic, and possessed a strategic mind that understood the changing nature of the war. He realized that the Goths could not beat the Romans in pitched battles of heavy infantry, nor could they outspend the emperor. But they could win the hearts of the people. Totila initiated a policy that was revolutionary for his time. He presented himself not as a barbarian conqueror, but as the protector of the Italian peasant and the slave. He freed the agricultural slaves who worked the vast Roman estates and invited them to join his army. He strictly forbade his soldiers from looting the countryside or harming the civilians. He paid for what he took. The contrast was stark and devastating for the imperial cause. The barbarians were acting with Roman virtue, while the Roman generals were acting like rapacious bandits. Totila's campaigns were a masterpiece of speed and surprise. He did not march on Ravenna. He marched south, bypassing the strongholds, sweeping through Tuscany and Campania, liberating or reconquering city after city. The imperial generals, squabbling in their fortresses, were paralyzed. At the Battle of Faventia and the Battle of Mugello, Totila crushed the imperial armies, not with superior numbers, but with superior morale and tactics. By 543, he had captured Naples again. This time, there was no sack, no slaughter. Totila treated the starving citizens with immense compassion, feeding them gradually so they would not die from the shock of sudden food. He dismantled the walls so the city could not be used against him again, but he left the people in peace. The situation in Italy had become a catastrophe for Justinian. The jewel he had reclaimed was slipping through his fingers. In desperation, in 544, he played his only remaining card. He sent Belisarius back to Italy. But this was not the triumphant return of a conquering hero. It is one of the saddest chapters in military history. Justinian, jealous and fearful of Belisarius's popularity, gave him no money and almost no troops. Belisarius was forced to recruit volunteers in Thrace and sail to Italy with a ragtag force, expected to perform miracles with nothing but his name. Belisarius arrived to find a land that was broken. The roads were empty, the fields lay fallow, and the people viewed him with suspicion. He spent 5 agonizing years sailing from Port to Port Ravenna, Dyrrhachium, Porto, trying to maneuver against Totila, but without the soldiers to risk a pitched battle. He was a lion without claws, watching from the ramparts of coastal fortresses as Totila swept through the interior. The tragedy culminated in the Second Siege of Rome by the Goths in 546 AD. Totila surrounded the Eternal City. This siege was far more terrible than the first. The imperial commander inside, Bessus, was a man of profound corruption. He had stockpiled grain, but instead of feeding the population, he sold it to the wealthy at extortionate prices while the poor died in the streets. The suffering of Rome during this siege is difficult to describe. The population, already reduced, resorted to eating nettles, dogs, mice, and finally, the dung of animals. The great city, once the capital of the world with 1 million inhabitants, was reduced to a ghost town of starving skeletons wandering the marble colonnades. Finally, in December 546, Isaurian guards at the Asinarian gate, unpaid and disgruntled, betrayed the city to Totila. The Goths entered Rome at night. But Totila was different. He prayed in St. Peter's Basilica. He did not massacre the population. There were hardly any left to massacre. Only about 500 civilians remained in the entire city. Totila, in a moment of strategic fury, planned to turn Rome into a sheep pasture. He declared he would raze the city to the ground, destroying the buildings and the walls so it could never again serve as a base for the Greeks. He tore down a third of the Aurelian walls and burned the gates. But then a letter arrived. It was from Belisarius.